This is Sheila talking to you from my studio in Port Townsend, Washington about scene arrangement for 11 stories. I want to quote from a couple of books that I find really, really useful when it comes to writing scenes and arranging them. The first one is Nancy Lamb's book, The Art and Craft of Storytelling, A Comprehensive Guide to Classic Writing Techniques. And the second one is Fiction Writer's Workshop by Josip Novakovic. Both of them have a lot of information in them that anybody writing fiction will really enjoy reading and learning from. So Nancy Lamb says that writers have to pace their stakes. As you construct your plot points, take care not to raise the stakes too high too soon. If you do this, you can't escalate the action to a plausible height when you reach the climax of the story. So save your finale for the finale. She's warning you not to kill off 50 characters in unusual ways in the first part of your story, because then what? What gets worse than that? So she introduces these kinds of scenes. One she calls in medias res, and the other one scenus interruptus. In medias res means that you can start right in the middle of a scene. So she says, trying to write a scene about a party, and for days she was trying to figure out how to get her character there when a friend of hers said, just start at the party. You can always catch the writer up after. And that's true. And when you're at the party, you can have flashback scenes. That would be the scenus interruptus. You can have backstory information. You can do things that both fulfill the promise of a story for your reader and keep them anticipating things. You break up the story, you create suspense. For instance, she says, if you have a woman climbing down a ladder from her bedroom to meet her boyfriend, knowing that if her father catches her, he's going to ship her off to another country, we have some suspense. But rather than let her get to the bottom of the ladder and find her father there, why not, Nancy says, shift to another point of view and let us see what the boyfriend's doing and what he's thinking and wanting. And then when you shift back to the woman on the ladder, you can let the reader know that time has passed just by showing us something like her hands gripping the side rails, and we'll fill in that she must have continued down the ladder while we were busy finding out about her boyfriend. So we have the idea that you can enter a scene mid-party, and you can interrupt that scene with flashbacks or changing the point of view, moving what she calls to the other side of the plot. So we have tricks as writers, things we can do, and there's no set rule about how this all works, but I think we just get sensitive to our options and start to employ them. In Josip Novakovic's Fiction Writer's Workshop, he has very helpful descriptions of how scenes work in arrangement to advance the plot in classically structured stories. He says that any conflict that evolves must culminate in a scene where the protagonist and antagonist meet and clash. And he says you must raise expectations and delay answering them. The answer must come gradually through sensory details or dialogue exchange or both. You must keep your reader guessing through the action and how you're handling it. He says you need at least one fully realized scene that takes place in the here and now or there and then of the story, and he calls this the big scene. The most dramatic scene in your story will usually combine dialogue, scene, description, and other fiction elements, but what comes before must introduce characters and conflicts. You don't want to interrupt the action of the story to fill the reader in. That's boring, and it bops the reader right out of the story, and they remember that there's a writer writing this, and oops, they forgot to tell you something. So we want it to be smooth, and when you do use backstory, you want it to be for a reason that's compelling to the reader, compelling about that character. Then we need to learn things in enough time to march towards the big scene and get a lot from that conflict between the antagonist and the protagonist. So Novakovic talks about the preparation for the big scene as using minor scenes, such as summary scenes in which an action is described that happens repeatedly, and we don't have to think about one particular occurrence of that action yet. Silent scenes are another kind of scene that can lead up to the big scene, and in the silent scene, the narrator tells what's going on, but succinctly. There might be indications of talk, but no actual direct dialogue. And there's going to be lots of sensory details so we understand where we are and what is happening in that scene, even though our characters aren't directly talking. He recommends the classically structured story in which small scenes, narrative, big scenes with dialogue alternate to keep the reader fresh from page to page. And we're going to look at a story where I think all of this is going on. The small scenes, as in summary and silent, the narration of the narrator, then the big scenes with dialogue, everything alternating until we get to a climax. And because it's a short story, I think that we have the at least one big scene for the climax. So this is a story by Ron Carlson, one of my favorite fiction writers, and it is called Bigfoot Stole My Wife. Starts right off with the narrator. The problem is credibility. Okay, a problem, but why is he talking to us about credibility? The problem, as I'm finding out over the last few weeks, so the here and now of the story is the last few weeks, it's basic credibility. A lot of people look at me and say, sure, Rick, Bigfoot stole your wife. It makes me sad to see it, the look of disbelief in each person's eye. Trudy's disappearance makes me sad too, and I'm sick in my heart about where she may be and how he's treating her, what they do all day, if she's getting enough to eat. I believe he's being good to her. I mean, I feel it, and I'm going to keep hoping to see her again, but it is my belief that I probably won't. So this narrator sounds a little out to lunch, but he's empathetic. He seems concerned about Trudy. Is she eating enough? I find that sort of funny in this list of things, what they do all day. He's trying to envision the life of his wife who has been stolen. He's sad not to see her, but he's convinced himself that Bigfoot's treating her okay, so he doesn't really have to worry. But next comes a summary scene. So we had narration, now we have a summary scene. This is something that happened over and over again. And inside this summary scene, there is a little scene interruptus. He probably will never see his wife again, he says, but he looks back rather than forward or staying in the moment of his sadness. So he's kind of interrupting his sadness in order to fill us in on how things were. In the 2.5 years we were married, I often had the feeling that when I would come home from the track and something would be funny. Oh, she'd say things, one of these days I'm not going to be here when you get home, things like that. Things like everybody says, how stupid of me not to see them as omens. When I'd get out of bed in the early afternoon, I'd stand right here at this sink, and I could see her working in her garden in her cut-off Levi's and bikini top, weeding, planting, watering. I mean, it was obvious. I was too busy thinking about the races, weighing the odds, checking the jockey roster to see what I now know. He was watching her, too. He'd probably been watching her all summer. So we don't have direct dialogue. We have remembered dialogue. It's one of the kinds of things she'd say that he saw not as indications that maybe she was unhappy with him and was going to flee, but as omens that he realizes now were that Bigfoot was there watching. So he's getting a little stranger, or I should say not stranger so much as firm in his belief that he's the credible one. So, in a way, it was my fault, he narrates. But what could I have done? Bigfoot steals your wife. I mean, even if you're home, it's going to be a mess. He's big and not well trained. And here comes a silent scene. This happened one time, not repeatedly, like getting downstairs and looking out the window in the morning before he went to the races. It's something that happened one time. He came home and he saw all of this in the moment of the here and now of his story. He knew that it was Bigfoot who stole his wife. So as we read this one, note the sensory details that appeal to our senses of sight and smell. When I came home, it was 11:30. The lights were on, which really wasn't anything new, but in the ordinary mess of the place, there was a little difference, signs of a struggle. There was spilled Dr. Pepper on the counter and the fridge was open, but there was something else, something that made me sick. The smell of Bigfoot. It was hideous. The guy is not clean. Half of Trudy's clothes are gone, not all of them, and there's no note. Well, I know what it is. It's just about midnight there in the kitchen, which smells like some part of hell. I close the fridge door. It's the saddest thing I've ever done. There's a picture of Trudy and me leaning against her Toyota, taped to the fridge door. It was taken last summer. There's Trudy in her bikini top, her belly brown as a bean. She looks like a kid. Well, she was a kid, I guess, 26. The 2 times she went to the track with me, everybody looked at me like how'd I rate her. But she didn't really care for the races. She cared about her garden and Chinese cooking and Buster, her collie, who I guess Bigfoot stole too, or ate. Buster isn't in the photo. He was nagging my nephew Chuck, who took it. Anyway, I closed the fridge door, and it's like part of my life closed. Bigfoot steals your wife, and you're in for some changes. So he's described to us in what I call a silent scene, the mess he saw, the smell he smelled, and the clothes that weren't there anymore. And then his eyes land on the picture, and he's able to interrupt and go back in time to when that picture was taken, and where Buster was, and we get introduced to his life a little bit more. And then he says the saddest thing he ever did was close that refrigerator door. And now we go to another silent scene. So we've had narration, silent, more silent. In this silent scene, which also happened once, we learn about dialogue, but we don't hear it said. You come home from the track having missed the daily double by a neck, and when you enter the home you are paying for, and in which you and your wife's collie live, and your wife and her collie are gone, as is some of her clothing, there's nothing to believe. Bigfoot stole her. It's a fact. What should I do? Ignore it? Chuck came down and said something like, well, if Bigfoot stole her, why'd he take the silica? Christ, what a cynic. Have you ever read anything about Bigfoot not being able to drive? He'd be cramped in there, but I'm sure he could manage. All right, we got Chuck again. We have some remembered conversation. He said something like, why did he take the silica? And then we have the reasoning again in this silent scene about this narrator's thought process. And narration, straight narration, comes next. I don't really care if people believe me or not. Would that change anything? Would that bring Trudy back here? Pull the weeds in her garden? As I think about it, no one believes anything anymore. Give me one example of someone believing one thing. No one believes me. I myself can't believe all the suspicion and cynicism there is in today's world. Even at the races, some character next to me will poke over at my tip sheet and ask me if I believe that stuff. If I believe, what is there to believe? The horse's name? What he did the last time out? And I look back at this guy, too cheap to go $2 on the program, and I say, it's history. It is historical fact here. Believe. Huh. Here's a fact. I believe everything. What is there to believe? Everything. So this is one of the strangest deconstructions of an intellectual idea that I have come across. After he says credibility, I believe everything, credibility. And what he said at the opening was, the problem is credibility. So here comes the setup for the big scene in the form of another silent scene. Again, setting it up. Your arrangement is always moving you towards the big scene, the climax. When I was 13 years old, my mother's trailer was washed away in the flooding waters of the Harley River and swept 31 miles, ending right side up and nearly dead level just outside Mercy. In fact, in the old weed-eaten parking lot for the abandoned potash plant. I know this to be true because I was inside the trailer the whole time with my pal Nuggie Reinbecker, who found the experience more life-changing than I did. All right, there's a promise in here. What happened to Nuggie? There's some stuff that's weird. 31 miles. Now, who's going to believe this story? I mean, besides me, because I was there. People are going to say, come on, 31 miles? Don't you mean 31 feet? So, okay, he doesn't. He means 31 miles. And so here comes the big scene. And in the scene, we have Nuggie and we have our narrator. We have the flood. We have the trailer. We have the stuff inside the trailer coming up. And we have the introduction of another character, the sheriff's cousin, who has a very important role to play. And in a way becomes the antagonist because, as you'll see, this sheriff's cousin has a different take on what's happened to Nuggie. And that has changed the way this storyteller, this narrator, thinks about credibility. We had gone in out of the rain after school to check out a magazine that belonged to my mother's boyfriend. It was a copy of Dude, and there was a fold-out page I will never forget of a girl lying on a beach on her back. It was a color photograph. The girl was a little pale. I mean, this was probably her first day out in the sun, and she had no clothing on. So it was good, but what made it great was that they had made her a little bathing suit out of sand. Somebody had spilled a little sand just right here and there, and the sand was this incredible gold color, and it made her look so absolutely naked. You wanted to put your eyes out. Nuggie and I knew there was a flood danger in Griggs. We'd had a flood every year almost, and it had been raining for 5 days on and off. But when the trailer bucked the first time, we thought it was my mother come home to catch us in the dirty book. Nuggie shoved the magazine under his bed, and I ran out to check the door. It only took me a second, and I hollered back, "Hey, no sweat, no one's here." Direct dialogue. But by the time I returned to see what other poses they'd had this beautiful woman commit, Nuggie already had his pants to his ankles and was involved in what we knew was a sin. If it hadn't been the timing of the first wave with this act of his, Nuggie might have gone on to live what the rest of us call a normal life. But the Harley had crested, and the head wave, which they estimated to be 3 feet minimum, unmoored the trailer with a push that knocked me over the couch and threw Nuggie, already entangled in his trousers, clear across the bedroom. I watched the village of Griggs as we sailed through. Some of the village, the Exxon station, part of it at least, and the car wash, which folded up right away, tried to come along with us, and I saw the front of Painter's Mercantile, the old porch and signboard, on and off all day. You can believe this, it was not a smooth ride. We'd ripped along for 10 seconds, dropping and growling over rocks and rumbling over tree stumps, and then wham! The front end of the trailer would lodge against a rock or something that could stop it, and whoa! We'd wheel around sharp as a carnival ride. Worse, really, because the furniture would be thrown against the far side and us with it, and sometimes we'd end up in a chair, and sometimes the chair would sit on us. My mother had about 4,000 knickknacks in 5 big box shelves, and they gave us trouble for the first 2 or 3 miles, flying by like artillery. Left, right, some small glass snail hits you in the face, later in the back, but that stuff all finally settled in the foot, and then 2 feet of water, which we took on. We only slowed down once, and it was the worst. In the railroad flats, I thought we had stopped, and I let go of the door I was hugging and tried to stand up, and then swish, another rush sent us right along. We rammed along all day, it seemed, but when we finally washed up in Mercy, and the sheriff's cousin pulled open the door and got swept back to his car by water, and quite a few of those knickknacks, just over an hour had passed. We had averaged, they figured later, about 32 miles an hour, reaching speeds of up to 50 at Lime Falls and the Willows. I was okay and walked out bruised and well washed, but when the sheriff's cousin pulled Nuggie out, he looked genuinely hurt. "For God's sake," I remember the sheriff's cousin saying, "the damn flood knocked this boy's pants off." But Nuggie wasn't talking. In fact, he never hardly talked to me again in the 2 years he stayed at regional school. I heard later, and I believe it, that he joined the monastery over in Malcolm County. My mother, because she didn't have the funds to haul our rig back to Griggs, worried for a while, but then the mayor arranged to let us stay out where we were. So after my long ride in a trailer down the flooded Harley River with my friend Nuggie Reinbecker, I grew up in a parking lot outside of Mercy, and to tell you the truth, it wasn't too bad, even though our trailer never did smell straight again. So this is a big scene. It's a big story. It gets more exciting the more the water is rushing, the more detail we get about things flying at them, and then when they're stopped, and the sheriff's cousin says what he has to say about Nuggie's pants and the flood. Everything's cast in a new light. So maybe the flood is the antagonist, but I think that it's just sheriff's cousin actually with his assumption about how Nuggie's pants got down around his ankles, which lets our speaker, the narrator, spin his whole way of thinking in a new direction. Credibility. What's credibility? Everybody sees something different. So now he says, now you can believe all that. People are always saying, don't believe everything you read or everything you hear. And I'm here to tell you, believe it. Everything. Everything you read, everything you hear. Believe your eyes, your ears, believe the small hairs on the back of your neck. Believe all of history and all of the versions of history and all the predictions for the future. Believe every weather forecast. Believe in God, the afterlife, unicorn showers on Tuesday. Everything has happened. Everything is possible. Don't feel the footprint of the writer Ron Carlson in here. You want to write well? Believe everything. They make good stories. So that, I think, was the climax, the big scene and the story we're moving toward. We have learned that by hearing the sheriff's mistaken idea about what happened to Nuggie, the narrator made a lesson for himself out of credibility, and out jumps a lesson for us as writers. Why worry about what's credible? Let's make up stories. This is fiction, after all. I came home from the track to find the cupboard bare. Trudy is not home. The place smells funny, hairy. It's a fact, and I know it as a fact. Bigfoot has been in my house. Bigfoot stole my wife. She's gone. Believe it. I gotta. So I have long loved this story for its unreliable narrator, who you think you are seeing through because it seems as if he's misreading his wife's reasons for leaving. He gambles at the track. He doesn't have much in common with her. She gardens, loves her collie, and cries, and he cries when he closes the refrigerator because his wife won't be there to cook for him or grab him a beer, or more sympathetically, perhaps because the domesticity that made him feel good will be gone for him. We don't know, and he doesn't have any real, like, desire to go find his wife. He just figures Bigfoot's too big. We don't like this guy too much, I don't think, and we certainly think he's in denial. But I think we have some sympathy for him too. The narrator has to believe his senses no matter what people think of his credibility. He's kind of just that way. What else does he have going for him, really? The intellect doesn't seem to be well developed. Although the writers who's giving us this lesson about believing things so we can put them in our stories certainly does have intellect. But in the book, News of the World, which is the collection of short stories by Ron Carlson, in which this one, Bigfoot Stole My Wife, appears, just as we think that this unreliable narrator can't be believed, and that's the fun of the story, we find out that maybe he's smarter than we think in the way that he tunes into his senses, because the title of the next story is I Am Bigfoot. And Bigfoot has stolen his wife. And Bigfoot has a warning. So here are the two links you can use to find these stories online. I hope when you're writing your stories, you think about scene arrangement in terms of summary scenes, silent scenes, big scenes, alternating them in arrangements so that you're always working towards a big scene, even if it's not the only big scene like it is in this short story. And see what you can do with that kind of arrangement, remembering that inside your scenes, you can have flashbacks, you can have backstory, you can you can allow the reader to find out more from scenes that you've just splashed into. Thank you, and good luck with your scene arrangements. See you soon.